Rarely does the world witness a moment of defiance so striking from African leadership. But in late May 2025, that moment came not from one country, but from a united front. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, known for his uncompromising stance against neocolonialism, stood shoulder to shoulder with Niger's President General Abdourahmane Tani in a shocking disclosure that sent ripples through global diplomatic circles. Together, they didn't just issue a statement, they exposed what they claimed to be a covert conspiracy, a foreign superpower. Specifically, China allegedly offered $10 million to terrorist groups in exchange for a fragile peace along the Agadem oil pipeline corridor. In a nearly 4-hour national broadcast aired on RTN, General Tani, who rarely addresses the public, broke his silence with an explosive accusation. China, widely seen as a development partner, might be playing a dangerous double game. What's even more remarkable is the crucial role of intelligence cooperation within the Sahel Alliance AIS, a tri-national coalition of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, which was instrumental in uncovering and halting this alleged transaction. Information shared from Burkina Faso reportedly helped trace the money trail through Paris, identify a female intermediary named Dr. Mina, and flag Mamadou Salah, a Nigerian citizen in exile, as the courier tasked with delivering the funds to insurgents. This revelation was no longer just a domestic scandal for Niger. It became part of a much larger narrative, one where African nations are shedding their dependency on foreign powers and beginning to chart their own sovereign course. The core danger here wasn't just the money, it was the principle behind it. Instead of diplomacy or developmental aid, a major global power allegedly chose backdoor bribery as a tool to secure its oil interests at the expense of African lives and regional stability. In this video, we dig deep into this unprecedented scandal, the alleged $10 million deal, the firm and uncompromising response from the Nigerian leadership, and how the AES nations are quietly rewriting the rules of engagement in Africa. Because this isn't just a story about pipelines and contracts, it's a story about sovereignty, conviction, and the rise of an Africa that no longer bows. The Sahel region of Africa has long been synonymous with instability, terrorism, and geopolitical chess games between foreign powers. But since 2023, something quietly revolutionary has been unfolding. No longer the backdrop for exploitation or passive governance, this region is now the birthplace of a bold new alliance. The Alliance of Sahel States AES, comprised of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Once colonies of France, these three nations are now emerging as the epicenter of a continental shift, one that is rooted in self-determination, anti-interventionism, and sovereign control of natural resources. The AES was not formed simply for economic purposes. It was born out of necessity, a direct response to cross-border terrorism, mounting pressure from Western institutions, and decades of exploitative contracts that left these countries resource-rich but economically weak. At the forefront of this transformation are three military leaders: President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, President Abdourahmane Tani of Niger, and President Assimi Goïta of Mali. These men are not polished career politicians, they are pragmatic, security-minded, and deeply committed to rewriting their nation's futures. From the moment of its formation, AES didn't waste time on symbolism. The bloc immediately launched a joint security task force, began cross-border military patrols, and implemented a tri-national intelligence sharing system. It was this very framework that allowed AES to detect and halt the alleged $10 million terrorist payment tied to China. Early warnings from Burkina Faso alerted Niger to suspicious financial activity through Paris, ultimately leading to the exposure of key intermediaries like Dr. Mina and Mamadou Salah. More than a security alliance, AES has become a platform for a new African diplomatic philosophy. All foreign partnerships, whether with China, Russia, or Western nations, are now subject to one non-negotiable condition: respect for sovereignty and mutual benefit. This principle has already redefined foreign policy in the region. One example, the coordinated expulsion of Western diplomats and a complete restructuring of oil and mining contracts, once dominated by foreign corporations. President Traore once declared, "We do not trade our freedom for support, and no amount of money can buy our silence." That attitude has helped cement AES as Africa's new power bloc, not through loud declarations, but through bold action. In a world where foreign actors still view Africa as a continent to be managed, mined, or manipulated, the emergence of AES is a wake-up call. These nations are no longer waiting to be rescued or validated. They are building systems, defending borders, and demanding a seat at the table, not as beneficiaries but as equals. Through unity, discipline, and an unshakable belief in their people, the leaders of AES are showing the world that Africa doesn't need saviors. It needs space to stand on its own, and perhaps for the first time in decades, that space is finally being claimed. May 30, 2025 marked a turning point in the political history of Niger. On national television, in a rare and lengthy 4-hour interview broadcast, live on RTN, President Abdurrahman Tani shattered months of silence. But among the many revelations he shared, one stood out as truly seismic. The Chinese ambassador to Niger was allegedly involved in a covert plan to fund local terrorist groups with $10 million. This money, Tani claimed, wasn't for humanitarian aid or development. It was meant to buy peace for the Agadem oil pipeline, a multi-billion-dollar project under Chinese investment, which had come under repeated attacks from insurgent groups. According to the president, the Chinese were attempting to secure the project's completion by paying off the very forces threatening it, a move that risked legitimizing terrorism as a bargaining tool. The plan allegedly involved a woman named Dr. Mina and Mamadou Salah, a Nigerian national living in exile and wanted for subversion. The scheme was elaborate. The money would be routed through Paris, transferred to Nigeria, either Abuja or Sokoto, where Mamadou would collect and deliver it to armed groups operating in the Sahel. Tani was blunt. "We know where he went, what passport he used, and how he planned to leave. We are not guessing, we are certain." But how did Niger discover this covert operation? The key lies in the intelligence sharing network of the AES alliance. In recent months, AES member states had launched a tri-national security and financial intelligence unit tasked with monitoring suspicious transactions and cross-border threats. The first red flag came from Burkina Faso. Their security services intercepted encrypted communications and flagged a suspicious fund transfer originating from Chinese-linked entities in Paris. Upon further investigation, they identified Dr. Mina and linked her to Mamadou Salah. When this intelligence was shared with Niger, the reaction was immediate. A special investigative team was assembled in Niamey, working in coordination with security agencies in Burkina Faso and Mali. They reconstructed the flow of funds, tracked phone records, confirmed passport activities, and uncovered the operational timeline. They found that the plan was already in its final stages. The money was due to be withdrawn from a bank in Sokoto within days. Acting swiftly, Niger summoned the Chinese ambassador for a closed-door meeting. The message was crystal clear. "We know what's happening. If this partnership is to continue, this game must end immediately." Confronted with undeniable intelligence and growing political risk, the ambassador backed down, and the money transfer was quietly canceled. But the story didn't end there. Niger took the matter further. With the evidence in hand, the government expelled 3 high-level Chinese officials, citing behavior inconsistent with diplomatic norms. This marked a dramatic shift in tone from previous years, when China was one of the few powers still maintaining strong relations with Niger after its 2023 military transition. And then came the real game-changer. President Tani announced the nationalization of 2 key oil assets, the Agadem and Bilma fields. These reserves, previously under majority Chinese control through PetroChina, were now reassigned to Niger's state-owned oil company, Sononyep. It was not a symbolic gesture, it was a full-scale policy shift, aimed at restoring sovereign control over the country's most strategic industry. What's extraordinary about this sequence of events is how efficiently and decisively Niger and AES acted. There was no drawn-out investigation, no public sparring, no international arbitration. It was African intelligence, African coordination, and African leadership working in lockstep to protect their people and resources. This wasn't just a security success, it was a statement of self-respect and strategic maturity. And what it revealed was even more profound. Foreign powers, including those seen as friendly, are not above playing both sides of a conflict if it serves their interests. But this time, Africa said no. Through coordination action and a clear moral compass, AES turned what could have been a silent betrayal into a powerful declaration. What was meant to be a quiet deal in the shadows ended as a bold reassertion of sovereignty. Niger made it clear this continent is no longer a playground for foreign games, and when push comes to shove, Africa will defend itself with unity, intelligence, and resolve. Uncovering the $10 million conspiracy wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a calculated and historic response. The government of Niger didn't simply block a financial transaction. It seized the moment to reshape its national strategy and redraw the boundaries of foreign influence, particularly in the country's critical oil sector, long dominated by outside powers. One of President Abdurrahman Tani's first and boldest actions was the expulsion of 3 senior Chinese officials from Niger. No formal press conference, no diplomatic maneuvering, just a decisive and unapologetic act that sent a clear message: cooperation does not mean submission. This was a shocking move to many international observers, especially considering that China had been one of the few powers still engaging positively with Niger after the 2023 military-led political transition. But Tani's administration was not acting out of emotion. This was a deliberate strategy, and it went further. In the weeks that followed, the government issued 2 landmark decrees: the nationalization of the Agadim and Bilma oil blocks. These fields, previously under significant Chinese control via PetroChina, were transferred to Sonanyep, Niger's state-owned oil company. It was a move that stunned analysts not just because of its boldness, but because it was executed with strategic precision. This wasn't isolationism. President Tani was clear: we do not have a problem with China. But if they want to continue working with us, they must play by new rules. Going forward, foreign corporations would be welcomed only in technical advisory roles, and only if they respected Niger's right to final decision-making on all strategic resources. Alongside the nationalizations, Niger also rolled out new legal conditions for foreign oil contractors, a requirement to prioritize local engineers, local labor, and local subcontracting. Any attempt to bypass these conditions would be treated as a violation of national sovereignty. Investigations soon revealed that Chinese oil firms had repeatedly violated these terms. They hired Chinese engineers over Nigerian professionals, imported labor from China, and routed lucrative service contracts back to Chinese subsidiaries, effectively shutting out Niger's domestic workforce. The Nigerian leadership viewed this not just as a breach of contract, but an insult to the nation's dignity. Speaking on behalf of the Prime Minister, Ibrahim Hamidou, Niger's head of government communications, declared, "We are not asking for much. We are asking that companies respect our laws, use our people, and contribute to our economy, not just extract from it." These sweeping changes marked a turning point for Niger, a shift from resource dependence to resource control. And Niger was not alone. The strategic support from its AES allies, Burkina Faso and Mali, added political and military weight to its decisions. Together, the alliance forged a unified front, agreeing that all international partnerships must now operate on the basis of transparency, fairness, and respect for sovereignty. At a landmark summit in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré made his stance unmistakably clear. If China or any global power thinks they can dictate terms on our land, we will remind them through action whose land this truly is. And indeed they did. AES is no longer a symbolic coalition. It is a functional and coordinated force with the capacity to protect its interests and rewrite regional norms. Niger's bold restructuring of its oil sector may have been the spark, but the broader revolution in sovereignty is now being carried by an entire bloc of African nations determined to reject the old playbook of dependency and compliance. For decades, Africa has been portrayed as a continent in need of aid, of protection, of expertise. But what AES is now showing the world is that Africa doesn't lack capability. It simply lacked the will to assert control on its own terms. That will has now arrived, and it is unapologetic. By standing up to a global superpower, asserting its rights over its oil and demanding accountability from foreign companies, Niger has taken its place at the forefront of a new African awakening, and it has done so with the backing of a united, disciplined alliance that refuses to be bought or intimidated. This is no longer about contracts and pipelines. It's about dignity, ownership, and rewriting the future. The $10 million conspiracy was not just an isolated diplomatic scandal. It was the flashpoint that illuminated a deeper, more profound truth about the state of global relations with Africa and how that paradigm is shifting. What began as a secretive deal to pacify militants around a pipeline has evolved into a powerful assertion of independence. For Niger, and for the broader Sahel region, this moment marked the beginning of a new era of self-determination, economic reclamation, and political realignment. Niger's response was nothing short of revolutionary. Instead of yielding to quiet pressure, ignoring the scheme, or negotiating behind closed doors, President Abdurrahman Tani chose exposure and confrontation. He named names, detailed the plan, and took firm action. His government did not merely block the payment, they used the incident as a catalyst to redefine Niger's relationship with foreign powers. This kind of leadership is rare. It requires not only courage, but clarity of vision. President Tani made it clear that Niger would no longer serve as an invisible partner in deals made outside its borders. Instead, the country would take command of its future, its resources, and its place in the world. This is a blueprint for post-colonial assertiveness, and other African nations are watching closely. But Niger was not alone in this journey. The support of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, composed of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, played a critical role in this transformation. Intelligence shared through AES's security framework was instrumental in uncovering the plot. Military coordination and political unity gave Niger the confidence to act boldly, and the ideological alignment among the leaders, particularly Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso and Assimi Goïta of Mali, reinforced the idea that Africa's strength lies in African solidarity. AES is not just a military pact. It is a declaration that the old rules no longer apply, that colonial-era contracts, foreign development models, and unbalanced partnerships are no longer acceptable, that Africa is no longer waiting for validation from the IMF, the UN, or the EU. AES members are showing that dignity is worth more than dependency. China's role in this story is complex. For years, Beijing was seen as a more respectful alternative to Western powers, offering infrastructure investment and non-interference. But this incident revealed the fragility of that narrative. Even partners who promise mutual development can act out of pure self-interest. And when they do, African leaders must be ready to draw red lines and enforce them. What sets Niger's case apart is not that a foreign power tried to manipulate its politics. That's a tale as old as colonization. What's different is that Niger and AES pushed back successfully. There were no leaked documents, no passive diplomatic notes, no unconvincing denials. There was action, there was sovereignty, and most critically, there was no fear. By expelling Chinese officials, reclaiming oil blocks, and declaring new rules of engagement, Niger laid down a precedent. It's a message to all foreign entities, East or West Africa is no longer open for exploitation. We will partner, but only on terms that serve our people. We will cooperate, but not capitulate. This marks a seismic change, not just for the Sahel, but for Africa as a whole. Because for decades, Africa's story has been one of reactive diplomacy. Leaders have tiptoed around foreign interests, afraid of aid cuts, sanctions, or loss of investment. This has bred a culture of silence, of compromise, of pretending not to see the manipulation happening behind closed doors. But something has changed. With young, unapologetic leaders like Traore and Goita, the continent is rediscovering its backbone. These are not men who aspire to please global think tanks or Western parliaments. They answer to their citizens, and they are not afraid to say what previous generations whispered only in private: we deserve to own what is ours. And they're proving it not just with words, but with laws, policies, and bold action. In reclaiming their oil, these nations are reclaiming their narrative. In rewriting the rules of foreign cooperation, they are redefining what leadership looks like in the global South. And in exposing foreign deceit, they are reminding the world that Africa is not naive. Africa is watching. Africa is aware. Perhaps most importantly, Africa is no longer waiting. What Niger did was not perfect, and the challenges ahead remain enormous. The country still faces security threats, economic instability, and pressure from powerful global stakeholders. But the direction is clear, and for the first time in a long time, that direction is not being set in Washington, Paris, or Beijing. It's being set in Niamey, Ouagadougou, and Bamako. What do you think of Niger's decision to stand up to China? Was it a courageous move towards sovereignty, or a risky gamble in a complex global economy? Do you believe more African countries should follow AES's model of self-assertion? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this video made you think, like, share, and subscribe for more in our ongoing series, Africa Choosing Itself. This is where we reveal the real stories behind foreign deals, untold power dynamics, and the rise of a continent no longer willing to be silent. Long before the headlines, long before the cameras began to roll, a quiet revolution was taking root in the hearts of everyday Africans. For decades, generations grew up internalizing the idea that power resided elsewhere, that decisions about their lands, their futures, and their wealth would be made in air-conditioned rooms in Paris, Beijing, or Washington. But something changed in 2025, not just on the political stage, but in the collective spirit of a people long underestimated. The decision by Niger to expose and confront a global power over alleged backdoor dealings wasn't just a policy shift, it was a signal flare. To every town, every village, and every youth in Africa, we are no longer invisible. For once, an African state was not asking for permission, it was taking a stand, and that changed everything. Young university students in Ouagadougou began hosting open debates, not on how to seek more foreign aid, but how to build resilient homegrown economies. In Mali, musicians took to the airwaves, with songs celebrating self-reliance, sovereignty, and local heroes who had the courage to say no. In Niger, women's cooperatives in Agadez printed pamphlets about community ownership of resources and distributed them in local markets, urging participation in the national dialogue. There was an unmistakable sense that the psychological map of Africa was being redrawn not by consultants or think tanks, but by the very people who had been kept at the margins of power. This shift in mindset is perhaps the most dangerous threat to neo-colonial structures, not sanctions, not tariffs, but the awakening of people who now believe they have the right to demand dignity, transparency, and control over their destiny. And this belief, once ignited, spreads faster than pipelines or money transfers. The leaders of the AES understand this deeply. They are not merely military men with tactical training. They are symbols of defiance in a world that often expects submission. What President Ibrahim Traoré, President Tani, and President Goita have managed to do is unlock the idea that Africa's future is not a favor to be granted by the powerful, but a birthright to be claimed by the rightful. In many ways, this era feels like a second independence, an emotional and spiritual liberation from the psychological chains of dependency. The first wave of African independence in the 20th century freed borders. This wave, seeks to free the mind. But what does this look like in practice? In the town of Dosso, teachers are rewriting civics curricula to include not only colonial history, but the post-colonial struggle for economic autonomy. In the outskirts of Bamako, former foreign-funded NGOs are transitioning into community-led cooperatives that source food-build schools and manage resources without a single dollar of international charity. And in Burkina Faso, young coders are building blockchain-based platforms to monitor local mining contracts, creating digital guardrails against future exploitation. Even the diaspora is feeling the call. Across Europe and North America, Africans who once sought escape from a broken system are now organizing, investing, and preparing to return, not just as individuals, but as catalysts for change. The message is spreading: home is not a place to flee. It is a place to fix. None of this is happening without resistance. Global corporations that once operated unchecked are now engaging in aggressive lobbying, warning of instability and economic isolationism. Think tanks funded by foreign interests are penning op-eds, questioning the rationality of African governments, asserting ownership over oil and minerals. But these reactions only highlight the discomfort that comes when the colonized refuse to stay in their lane. The world is not used to an Africa that challenges power with intelligence, evidence, and unity. The $10 million scandal, now infamous across diplomatic circles, was not about the money. It was about boundaries, and the world crossed one. There's a new lexicon emerging in African political thought. Words like self-determination, resource, justice, sovereign alignment, and post-aid strategy are entering the mainstream. The continent is crafting not only new policies, but new philosophies. These ideas are not born in universities. They're born in struggle, forged in sacrifice, and validated through courageous acts like Niger's. The road ahead is not without peril. There will be economic pressure, media distortion, even covert attempts to destabilize what cannot be discredited openly. But this time, Africa is walking into the storm with its eyes open and its back straight. And that makes all the difference. Because while foreign actors can withhold loans, they cannot withhold legitimacy. That comes from the people. And the people are watching, they are listening, and more importantly, they are ready. In marketplaces, in barracks, in classrooms and mosques, the conversation has shifted. No longer are people asking who will save them. They are asking what they must do to save themselves. This shift in language may seem small to outsiders, but it is the seed from which revolutions grow. What Niger did in May 2025 was historic, not because it embarrassed a superpower, but because it reminded the world and Africans themselves that power begins with truth. And truth, once spoken boldly, can never be unsaid. The alliance of Sahel states is not just a bloc, it is a blueprint. It is a mirror held up to every African nation still shackled by old contracts and quiet fear. And it dares to ask a dangerous, beautiful question. What if we owned everything we've always been told we needed permission to have? And now some are beginning to answer, we already do. As the dust began to settle over Niger's bold revelations, the world's response arrived in waves, measured, skeptical, and in many quarters stunned. Diplomatic briefings in Beijing, Brussels, and Washington buzzed with urgency, not because a war had broken out or a coup had taken place, but because an African nation had changed the rules of engagement and done so without flinching. China's official response was predictably muted. The Foreign Ministry denied any wrongdoing, dismissed the accusations as unfounded, and reaffirmed its commitment to mutual development. Behind closed doors, however, it was clear the incident had struck a nerve. The sudden withdrawal of technical personnel from Niger's oil fields, the cancellation of future investment forums, and the tightening of Chinese banking controls in West Africa all pointed to recalibrations in real time. Western nations, long accustomed to criticizing African governments for opacity and weak governance, found themselves in an awkward position. How could they condemn Niger's transparency when it was precisely the kind of action they often demanded? Publicly, they urged calm and continued cooperation with international partners. Privately, intelligence reports noted that other African countries were watching some, cautiously others with growing admiration. The story quickly became one of the most discussed events on African news channels, talk shows, and digital platforms. In Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya, popular podcasts dissected the implications. On the radio in Dakar, callers phoned in asking whether their governments would ever dare to reclaim control over foreign-run industries. In the bustling online forums of Johannesburg, hashtags like Bart Africa owns it and Das We're Not for Sale began trending. And then there was the role of African media itself, no longer content to simply echo foreign wire services. Independent outlets, often underfunded and operating in difficult environments, rose to the occasion. Investigative journalists from Côte d'Ivoire to Tanzania began digging into the terms of their own nation's extractive contracts. Editorials appeared in Swahili, French, Hausa, and Arabic, all centered on a shared idea: if Niger can do it, why can't we? Of course, not all reactions were supportive. In capitals dependent on Chinese infrastructure loans or Western military aid, officials scrambled to reassure their patrons that our cooperation remains strong. Critics within these governments argued that AES was being reckless, that severing ties with major global powers could lead to economic retaliation or isolation. But for every voice of caution, there was a growing counterpoint. What is the cost of silence? What is the cost of signing contracts that enrich foreign firms, while local communities remain without water, roads, or schools? These were not radical questions anymore. They were mainstream, and they were being asked not only by intellectuals, but by farmers, traders, and mechanics across the continent. In Niger itself, the government's actions ignited a complex debate. There were those who applauded President Tani's bravery, viewing it as a long overdue reckoning, but others worried about short-term consequences. Would jobs be lost? Would fuel prices rise? Would international aid be cut? The administration responded swiftly, announcing new investment in domestic oil processing, prioritizing local hiring, and launching a national campaign to explain the policy changes in clear, accessible language. It was a masterclass in political storytelling, meeting fear not with denial, but with information. Citizens were shown maps, project plans, and resource estimates. Town halls were held in rural areas where villagers could ask questions directly to government officials. In a region long plagued by secrecy and distance between power and people, the very act of explaining became revolutionary. The world had been caught off guard by Niger's stand, but within Africa, something even more profound was happening. People were no longer asking if it was possible, they were beginning to ask what came next. As political lines harden and international attention remains fixed on the actions of the AES, another force, quieter but just as powerful, is rising across Africa, the awakening of its youth. No movement in history has endured without the energy of a new generation, and the Sahel's redefinition of sovereignty is no exception. In the classrooms of Zinder, students once taught to memorize colonial timelines are now holding debates on mineral ownership and domestic legislation. In the tech hubs of Accra and Kigali, young Africans are building apps to track public spending and resource exports, demanding accountability with the same urgency that past generations demanded liberation. This is not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It is a calculated hunger for ownership, born of lived experience and hard lessons. Social media, once dismissed as a platform for distraction, has become a crucible for critical thought. On platforms like TikTok and Twitter, young Nigerians and Burkina post short videos explaining the meaning of nationalization. Hashtags such as We Claim, Our Future, and Sahel Strong carry weight far beyond digital boundaries. They have become expressions of a generation refusing to inherit subjugation as destiny. But there is also something deeper stirring beneath the surface, a spiritual return to principles long buried beneath dependency. For centuries, African cosmologies taught that land was not merely a commodity but a sacred inheritance. To lose control of the soil was not just an economic failure, it was a fracture of identity, a disconnection from ancestral purpose. What President Tani and the AES have begun to revive is not only political autonomy, but a restoration of cultural and spiritual sovereignty. Religious leaders, once silent on matters of state, have begun to speak up. In Friday sermons and Sunday services, imams and pastors are reminding congregations that justice begins with stewardship, and that a nation that cannot defend its resources cannot protect its people. Even traditional chiefs keepers of pre-colonial wisdom are being called upon to bless new policies and endorse leadership that aligns with the will of the people. It is not lost on anyone that the heart of this movement is the Sahel, a region known more for droughts and war than for political innovation. And yet, perhaps precisely because of its hardships, the Sahel has emerged as a crucible for clarity. When survival is not guaranteed, the decisions made must be deliberate. There is no room for half measures or illusions. The leaders of Burkina, Faso, Niger, and Mali are not merely reacting to foreign interference. They are forging a new ethos under fire. This clarity has led to a kind of moral diplomacy, a new language that speaks not only of contracts and borders, but of ethics, memory, and the sacred obligation to those yet unborn. Leaders are now judged not only by GDP growth, but by whether they've honored the dignity of their people. And in this new value system, courage ranks higher than comfort. That is why, despite economic risks and geopolitical backlash, the people continue to support these radical shifts. Because deep down they recognize something timeless, that a nation cannot rise if its people feel small. The AES is making its citizens feel large again, not through conquest, but through conviction. The next chapters of this story remain unwritten. There will be trials, setbacks, and perhaps even betrayals. But something irreversible has already occurred. The continent's center of gravity is shifting from deference to direction, from foreign saviors to internal strength. This is more than a policy moment. It is a generational calling. And the youth are no longer waiting for permission. They are building a future not based on imitation of the West, but on the rediscovery of Africa's original promise, that no matter how long it was denied, freedom belongs to those who claim it fully, loudly, and forever.